Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Friday meeting. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Demand and Distributed Energy Market Integration Stakeholder Meeting to discuss the Track 1 straw proposal on reflecting end user exports and demand response and the Track 2 issue paper on demand flexibility enhancements. My name is Elena Kopolov-Alford, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. Our presenters today will be Anya Gilbert, Manager in Policy Development, and Ansel Lundberg, Senior Policy Developer. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, these materials are available on the DEMI initiative page. You can get to that page by going to CAISO.com, navigating to the Stakeholder Center tab at the top, selecting Policy Initiatives, and that'll take you to our main initiative landing page. And from there, you can search DEMI, or you can scroll down and find that, and the latest documents, including the straw proposal and issue paper, will be at the top of that page. That's also where you will go for the comment template to input your written comments in the future as well. So some housekeeping reminders and engagement best practices. A reminder, the call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And we will post a video recording of this in a few business days to that same initiative page. We do structure the meetings to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives, but we ask that you please engage in a respectful and professional manner. Remember to introduce yourself when you unmute, and introduce yourself with your name and your organization before speaking, and please follow the facilitator's guidance for speaking and asking questions. When you go off mute, it usually takes a few seconds before the line connects, so just a little bit there. And please keep your comments brief, just to avoid repeating any comments that have already been made, to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to participate in a robust discussion today. If you need closed captioning or would like to see who else is on this meeting, you can click the transparency viewer on the bottom right of your WebEx screen. For raising your hand, again, a reminder to state your name and affiliation before making your comment. If you dialed in outside of WebEx, you can press *3 to get into the question queue. And if you would like to ask a comment or question in the chat, you can send that to all panelists, and we may respond to you directly, or we may read that out loud, depending on the question. If you need any technical assistance during the meeting, you can reach out to our event producer, Silas. And I'm going to hand it over here to Anya for objectives and agenda.
All right, great. Well, happy Friday, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us on a Friday morning. It's been a while since we have been together as a group on DEMI. We ended our working group phase at the end of 2025, and here we are kind of in the policy development phase. And I want us to kind of hone in on both our objectives and agenda for today. And first is really information sharing. Ansel Lundberg is going to be sharing the Track 1 straw proposal on reflecting end user exports and demand response. And I'll be following up with a Track 2 issue paper on what I'll term demand flexibility enhancements. And our goal with these updates is really to share the DEMI scope for 2026, and recognizing this is a multi-year effort, but we have scoped kind of what we believe we can practically achieve based on your input and internal analysis for 2026. We also want to hear from you. We want to hear clarifying questions, your informal feedback, and those really both help us understand your perspectives and areas for improvement, but we hope that it also assists you in drafting written comments, both to get that clarity and to hear from others with their questions. And those stakeholder comments, we're looking for that feedback by March 27th. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. Next slide. Maybe taking a step back, the CAISO does have a vision for demand flexibility that I wanted to share. And DEMI is a key pillar of that strategy and that vision. That strategy and vision is really a future where demand flexibility is reliably and economically integrated into grid operations and market optimization. While these pillars are very interrelated for the sake to as our coordination framework. And this is really an effort to kind of embark in improving our situational awareness and coordination related to both market and non-market distributed energy resources and demand flexibility. Ultimately, having this visibility is going to help us with producing a more accurate demand forecast and feeds into our market. The second pillar is our technology and data exchange pillar. And this is all about the infrastructure needed to support the coordination framework, that first pillar. It's about defining and developing the data exchange and technology requirements we have to support possible automation of information sharing between the ISO and relevant participants. Our third pillar, you can think of as the DDEME pillar. It's all about developing and enhancing pathways for supply side and demand side resources, really to enable greater demand side flexibility in our market. And lastly, our final pillar is about working with regulators to remove policy barriers that prevent demand flexibility from participating effectively, and also identifying data sharing opportunities. In DDEME, you'll recognize we have great crossover with policy discussions, as well as we'll have a lens through this initiative in thinking about how it relates to our coordination framework in terms of data collection for use in forecasting operations in our market. So moving on to the next slide, I want to talk about what we heard from you all when it comes to what we should take on in 2026. Just as a reminder, at the end of 2025, with that final discussion paper, we asked for your feedback to help us identify near, mid, and long-term priorities, recognizing there's limited kind of bandwidth to take on everything all at once. And so how do we stage some of this work in a multi-year initiative? And what we heard in that feedback was that a majority of stakeholders asked the ISO to focus on 3 near-term areas: a pathway for behind-the-meter exports in existing participation models, reforms to performance evaluation methodologies so that demand response and DER performance can be measured accurately, and also a request to initiate work on demand-side bidding frameworks to guide future policy design. But there were many caveats to that. Really an ask to take on this work, but not be at the expense of kind of that first or second request. We also heard kind of a subset of requests related to changes in participating load options, changes to the existing reliability demand response resource model, and requests for a reliability demand response product for WM and EDAM BAAs. And it's really the feedback that we heard from you all, coupled with our internal assessments and resourcing, that helped inform this year's DDEME scope that I'll share on the next slide. So let's move now to the next slide. So with that said, we've structured kind of our effort this year into 2 tracks and a working group. And thinking about what this entails, track 1, recognizing that there was a lot of discussion regarding kind of solutioning when it comes to end user exports and demand response, more of a straw proposal. You can think of this as a targeted technical issue, which allows end user exports within a demand response resource, whereas track 2 takes a step back and generally asks broader market design questions about how demand flexibility should participate across the region. So we're looking at demand response and large load participation options for WM and EDAM entities, large load participation options kind of across the footprint, just as a mirror to say, do we have the right supply and demand side participation pathways in place? And also looking at some smaller design refinements to the exception criteria for RDRR discrete dispatch caps. Recognizing that there is additional work kind of needed before policy development. Kind of those questions related to real-time demand-side bidding or real-time pump load bidding are going to be discussed in a Q3 working group, really to kind of gain greater alignment in definitions, explore how these type of constructs differ from the existing supply-side constructs, and explore the potential for kind of having those bidding frameworks in place. As you'll note, we didn't take on all 31 problem statements, and our issue paper and straw proposal has a section at the end called DW Scope that does have more information on that scoping. So I do want to refer folks to scan that section for how we have framed some of those near, mid, and longer term activities, and kind of a big note that a lot of the kind of more fundamental review of PEMS reform is coming next year, while we also have it scoped in track 1 as well. And so with that said, for any questions related to scope and kind of what was in or out, let's defer those to the end of this morning's conversation just to make sure that we can get through the material. But with that, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So as we move into policy development, our evaluations of some of the solutions are going to follow the 6 guiding principles that were developed by the working group. Efficiency, so looking to make sure that the solutions that we produce kind of have the market optimization, produce the least cost results while maintaining reliability. A principle related to competition, ensuring that there is competition between those smaller scale resources that participate like conventional large scale generators. We want to ensure feasibility of the solutions and that it is operationally feasible as well as feasible from an implementation perspective. We have a principle of simplicity to ensure that market design elements are not overly complicated. There's a reliability and compliance principle to kind of ensure that reliability and compliance standards are reflected in market design. And lastly, to facilitate state-level public policies to the extent practicable. These principles are kind of our guideposts to help frame the trade-offs that we'll ultimately kind of face as we get into some of the solution development. Those trade-offs between market efficiency, operational feasibility, and administrative complexity often come up. But wanted to reflect that these are guiding principles that will help us in kind of evaluating some of our solutions. Next slide. In terms of where we are in this process, I want to remind folks we're now in the policy development kind of phase of our initiative. What we kind of agreed to here and is kind of turned into a final proposal, then goes to our board for approval prior to going to FERC for approval, prior to it being embedded in our software systems and business practices. So I just wanted to hone in on where we are in the process. And then let's move to the next slide for our tentative schedule. So for illustrative purposes, I do have kind of a rough schedule. You'll notice not all months are highlighted, but it does look at essentially a 4-month policy development time window between, when we have released kind of our straw proposal and issue paper this week to kind of a final proposal developed in July ahead of an August board. I'll note that this is illustrative and subject to change based on our stakeholder discussions that we have. And I've also only noted the months when we are planning on releasing a paper. And again, this is subject to change. You might also be asking why there are 2 tracks And really, it is intended to reflect differing levels of topic readiness and really meant to allow flexibility for the two tracks to advance on different schedules if needed, including the possibility that we might bring these topics to separate board meetings if needed. And with that, I'll open it up to questions on kind of the background and process before turning things over to Ansel. Again, any questions on scope, let's save those for the end of today's discussion.
Okay, there are no questions. Thank you.
All right, with that, I'll hand things over to Ansel to discuss our Track 1 straw proposal.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Anya. So now that you have the context for this straw proposal and that we've all taken a moment to remind ourselves where we've come this past year in the DW process, I'll be speaking to the Track 1 straw proposal that was part of the paper that was posted this week for DW. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to start with some background, mostly focused on metering of demand response resources, but I'll talk a little bit about terminology for demand response, high-level review of how DR resources function in our markets, which we also discussed a bit in the working group, and then I'll also highlight a key problem statement from the discussion paper that we rooted this proposal in. Then I'll talk about the straw proposal itself, give an overview of that and some examples highlighted from the paper. And then we'll have a couple key considerations and some discussion questions for review with stakeholders. And we're right on time. I'll try to keep this to about 1 hour, and then we'll move on to track 2. We can go to the next slide. So the background section in the paper, in the track 1 portion, gives a good overview of how demand response resources function in the markets, and it also explains how DR meter data calculation processes work, as well as review a bit about how customers with behind-the-meter energy storage are accounted for as a part of a PDR today. So I'm gonna go over a little bit of that material here. So first here we have this slide that I just wanted to share to review some terminology and concepts that I'll be talking about today. First on the left, this box, I just wanted to share some similar and related terms that are speaking to the same concepts. Some of these are defined terms in our tariff, some of them are not. I tried to have some consistency that we use in the paper about these terms, but just so we're all on the same page. On the left, this column says end user. This is referring to the retail level customer that might be registered as a part of a PDR or a DR resource. That's also referred to as a site or a location, perhaps a service account that's measured at the LRA approved load meter. All of these are kind of slightly different terms depending on the context, referring to a similar concept of this retail level customer. And then on the right, the resource side, that's speaking to the resource in the ISO markets. In this case, an example of that would be a proxy demand resource, a PDR, or an RDRR, referred to also sometimes as an aggregation. But this is just a term to talk specifically about the resource that's offering energy into the ISO markets. And as we've discussed in the past, for PDRs in particular, they're limited to customers within an individual sub-lap within the ISO balancing area in particular. We have more about sub-laps in track 2 as well, but just wanted to highlight that. And then on the right, when we're talking about metering for DR resources, one common term is demand response energy measurement. So this is the calculated data that ends up in the settlement quality meter data that indicates how much energy was provided by a resource for settlement purposes. That is calculated using a performance evaluation methodology. We spent a lot of time talking about those in the working group. And that calculated methodology is used to create a baseline, which is compared against the actual customer load during the dispatch period for the resource to create the demand response energy measurement. It's kind of a simplified version of how it works. And then in the paper, and here I talk about DR resources, all of our performance evaluation methodologies can be applied to the demand response energy measurement for PDRs as well as RDRRs. So this is kind of a catch-all term. Let's go to the next page. So a little background, this is review from the working group last year, but the way that demand response in ISO markets provides direct participation of load as well as simplification of the scheduling of that participation. So to run through it quickly, starting off with the load side of things, the load serving entity forecasts or has their load forecasted and schedules their load in at the default load aggregation point, which is a part of our full network model. So that process occurs normally. But then in parallel, demand response providers, through their scheduling coordinator, offer a demand response or curtailable portion of that load into the market as a supply resource. So we talk about that as a pseudo generator. It's an offer from the demand response resource that appears as a generator. And on the fourth point, we've discussed this, but the load serving entity and the demand response provider for these same retail customers may be the same entity. It could be a utility and its own DR program, or it could be two separate entities as the utility or the LSE, and then a separate entity, a third-party entity as the demand response provider, and perhaps also the scheduling coordinator. And then ultimately, those loads are aggregated to the sublap level, and the settlement process occurs for the demand response. Let's go to the next slide. So this graph is just showing that demand response resources are known or are in the category of scheduling coordinator metered entities. They play that role in the metering process and all the responsibilities that holds, which includes the scheduling coordinator submitting meter data to the ISO that is calculated by them or the DRP. So if we go to the next slide, this kind of shows the process. We're going to be focusing today primarily on the meter data calculation portion of demand response sort of market activities, which includes the process that I spoke to on the terminology slide of calculating that meter data based on a customer load baseline, the performance evaluation methodology, and the customer load data during the dispatch period. Next slide. So this slide serves to demonstrate essentially how the SQMD calculation process works today and how it interacts with the rule that prohibits reflecting exports at the customer level onto the distribution system. So today, during that meter data development process that we just reviewed, at the retail customer level, the scheduling coordinator or DRP is required to essentially zero out on a customer-by-customer basis the actual load meter data in the intervals where a given customer might have been exporting. So our business practice manuals require that SCs replace those exporting intervals with zeros when they're calculating the meter data. So some customers within an aggregation, they may be customers today who are certified to export energy on the distribution system with an approved interconnection from their utility distribution company. Some of them may not be. But in any case, all of them must have any export intervals zeroed out during dispatch periods. And we have a little chart here from the paper, which I've just provided here, and I can talk through it a little bit. So if you're looking at this chart, it's showing how today's rules work. for calculating demand response energy measurement for a single end-use customer. So this is just looking at one retail customer with behind-the-meter energy storage. So these are the 6 intervals of an hour in the real-time market process. The line that's titled baseline value is a calculated baseline usual energy consumption during a non-dispatch period. The third line there, actual load during dispatch, represents the load meter data of the customer during dispatch period. So you'll see in the first part of the hour, they had curtailed their load from the baseline, but then in the remainder of the hour, the negative values represent periods where they may have been exporting onto the distribution system. The way our rules work today in ISO demand response metering is that during those exporting intervals, the scheduling coordinator must replace those negative values with zeros in order to do the meter data calculation. So the net result there is the bottom line, which you see as the difference between the baseline value row and the load during dispatch, or 0, whichever one is higher. So those exports, which are physically occurring and have been metered at the customer level, are not recognized or reflected in ISO calculations. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So to take us back to last year, I wanted to highlight this problem statement from the working group process that is captured in the discussion paper that we published at the end of the year. I'm going to read it here. It states that while PDR is the most compatible CAISO model for behind-the-meter interconnected storage, because it is conceptualized as load curtailment, it does not include any measured export of energy from individual locations to measure performance of the resource via any of our existing methodologies, including metering generator output methodology, so that behind-the-meter storage aggregations cannot offer the full resource capability, and PDR performance is artificially capped at levels reflecting conservative estimates of site load. This results in significant energy from behind-the-meter storage that is unused during events and unavailable to the ISO market. So when we considered this problem statement, we received significant customer feedback on the final discussion paper supporting the ISO taking action to address this problem. In their view, a solution to this problem would allow the ISO to more fully capture the demand response capabilities of customers with this behind-the-meter storage, including those exports onto the distribution system that are physically occurring but not reflected in the ISO metering procedures. Stakeholders did raise this issue particularly in the context of PDRs, but as I mentioned before, our methodologies apply to both PDRs and RDRRs. All right. A moment to answer questions because I went over some background material and then I'll get into the straw proposal. So I see one question in the chat. Yelena, will you help us out there?
Yeah, we have a question from Jan Strack from SDG&E asking, are community choice aggregators and direct access providers considered load serving entities for purposes of this discussion?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, and then we have one hand from Brian Turner, Advanced Energy United.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask some very basic questions here that I don't understand. When you went over the example of how the measurement occurs, the export doesn't eliminate the baseline in what I was seeing there. So on an exporting customer, it's zeroed out, and then you report the higher of the baseline or the zeroed out. So then the baseline appears in your final value there, going back one slide. And I don't understand that, why the battery wouldn't at least eliminate the baseline value.
Yeah, let's go back to slide 17, please. Good question, Brian. I think I understand what you're getting at here. It also might be a little confusing because when we talked about performance methodologies during DDEMI about a year ago, we talked about how charging impacts baseline calculations for particular baselines that we have. So this example is focused on sort of assuming that the baseline value in that first row under the hour ending 19 is calculated based on historic non-dispatch intervals, right? So it's sort of a predetermined value based on previous behavior. And then the actual load during dispatch line is the load meter data from the dispatch period. So we're going to subtract that line from the baseline value line to result in the DR energy measurement. So when you ask, so basically during the exporting intervals 2 through 6, instead of subtracting, so let's look at interval 2, instead of subtracting -3 from 1.75, which would result in 4.75 as the energy measurement, we have to subtract 0 from 1.75, which results in 0. So essentially, in the meter calculations at the ISO, it appears to us that the customer is essentially serving its own load with the battery, but there's no export occurring. So there's a self-supply happening because of that zeroing out. So is that helpful, or is there a specific?
Yeah, no, that's the part I'm not understanding. If the customer is serving their own load, then wouldn't the actual load be 0, at least? Right, if they normally are using 1.75 kilowatts and now they are serving their own load and exporting a bit, at least counting the serving your own load should bring that energy measurement, the DREM, down to 0, shouldn't it?
So the DREM is essentially, because it's the difference between the baseline and the actual behavior during dispatch, they are getting credit for that difference as energy produced for a PDR, because the curtailed load essentially represents energy into the market, because it's you know, the absence of load that otherwise would have been needed to be served. So the 1.75, and then each of those bottom line numbers gets added up for the essentially what they're seen to be generating during that hour to the ISO market. So it's like curtailment is generation in that sense.
Yes.
It's always a little bit difficult to describe this in verbal terms. Anya, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that's great, and I think what you'll also observe is, you know, that those it's additive. But I really am curious, Brian, if that addresses it, kind of the question of.
No, I'm sorry. I think it may be a very basic question, I'm afraid, that if a customer is normally using 1.75, their battery dispatches, their site load is served 1.75 kilowatts, and then there's export as well. I understand the export is not counted, but it appears here that that reduction in their customer load is not being reflected.
Brian, this is Heather. Let me jump in. Yeah, I'm trying to follow as well. Is your example captured in row 1, or is that, sorry, column 1 of RT interval? But instead of actual load during dispatch, your load would be 0. So instead of 0.5, you would be 0. And so we would expect you to have 1.5 at the bottom. Is that the nugget of the question?
Well, I think column 1 is a good example, right, where the customer has reduced their load by 1 kilowatt, and so that's reflected. In column 2, they have reduced it 3 kilowatts, which should at least eliminate the 1.75. And I understand that then the remaining 1.25, which is export, is not reflected. Understand that, but I don't see why the 1.75 is not reflected in the lowest row as eliminated.
Okay, so then so I think I'm understanding. So then if we move to column 2, well, Ansel, why doesn't DR energy measurement, right now it says 1.75, why doesn't that say 0, I think is what Brian's getting at.
Yep.
I see. So It says 1.75 because they would have been using 1.75. Instead, they actually use 0. We'll just ignore the export part for a moment.
Yep.
So to us, when you aggregate that up, it looks like that's their curtailed energy for what they would have otherwise used. And so that is represented as essentially generation in the ISO markets. So they would have used 1.75, instead they used 0, the difference is 1.75, that is counted as generation.
Okay, I think I am getting it now. Thank you.
Well, I guess I want to ask our
Good.
teams, are we maybe it's to take back to, and others should add comments, but I do want to make sure we're capturing everything. I know earlier we have a rule that it's the higher of 0 or the value. And I'm wondering if what Brian is capturing here is in our situation we're discussing for column 2, should the rule be the lower of 0 or the value?
It gets a little complicated with the sign.
Right. So maybe it's
sign
something to
of-
take back and take for further comments. But I think what Brian is raising is we just want to make sure that we've captured both measurements.
Right. Okay. We'll make a note of that.
Okay,
Thanks,
appreciate
Brian.
it.
Good question.
Thanks, Brian. Our next hand is from Nadia.
Back. Can you guys hear me okay?
Oh, I think it is just unmuted if you can introduce
Oh.
yourself again.
Yeah, this is Nadia Krantz from Pacific Core. Could you go back one slide, please? I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So the historic load meter data, how far back of historic data does the CAISO need for post-market? Like, is this every day that the program wasn't dispatched in addition to the day it was dispatched, like every day preceding it, or is it the prior day? I'm just trying to better understand the expectations.
Yeah, to some extent, it depends on the baseline being used to ensure that enough historic data can be provided to create that usual behavior and so that the ISO can audit that information. So 45 days is required for certain baselines, but separately, outside of the dispatch period, the ISO requires load meter data to be submitted for measurement for verification purposes as a part of our auditing process. So the answer is basically it depends.
Okay. No, that's helpful. And then my other question is that my understanding that PEMs were used in lieu of meter data being available. Was that a correct understanding?
So the PEM is used to create demand response energy measurement, which serves as settlement quality meter data. So you can think of it as, whereas, generating resource might have an SQMD plan with telemetry, and that meter data is submitted directly to the ISO. For DR resources, it's calculated through the process we just discussed.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Nadia. Our next hand is from John.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think we caught just the end of that.
Great. All right. This is John from SCE. I just wanted to know, has CAISO conducted any analysis on the total quantity of exports that does not get counted for exports? Has CAISO done any of that analysis? I just want to know whether or not how significant the problem really is. So just wanted to see if you had any insight on that.
That is a great question, John. We have not done that. I think we're open to entertaining data requests like that for analysis that would be helpful to stakeholders. But I see what you're asking, and I would need to look into the meter data and DR energy measurement submission process to understand kind of how much exposure the ISO would have to that and how it's captured in the load meter data. So.
Great. Yeah. So just kind of some thoughts. You know, if the number is significant, then I would kind of assume that CAISO would probably need a system in place or something to account for that excess energy that goes onto the grid, right? So that's just one thought. The second thought is really, you know, how CAISO will manage that load and generation uncertainty if there's no measure in place. So that's just my comment. Another comment I would like to make is there any chance CAISO could kind of frame this topic up to and so that we can understand better what type of customers make up that excess, that export quantity? Are these customers part of a retail program that are maybe on like NEM, and whether or not they're also getting paid on their bills? So that would be helpful if you can kind of provide that additional information.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think I hear sort of the information that you're asking for and how it could be helpful to understand sort of the scale of this, of the impact here and what's happening today. I think there's some information, the rate information, the ISO may not have that information ourselves. So we might, you know, we might have to work with our partners to get an answer on that, or so I'll just say that. Anya, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, maybe another way that I'm hearing your question is, you know, that ask of, you know, how things exist today in terms of is the kind of extent of kind of behind the meter exports that are being zeroed out. And I think that question is relevant in terms of the existing fleet. And some of these efforts are to see if this would help enable new DR resources to come online and use this model. So I think it's a very relevant question in terms of kind of a look back, but also recognizing that answering that question might not capture prospective opportunities. And then on the retail question in terms of the percentage of those resources or the end use customers within the PDR that are also on NEM, we do not have access to kind of that rate information. So just to piggyback off of Ansel's comment, you know, needing to work with kind of the LSCs to understand both of those components and potentially the UDCs as well, kind of coupling which resources are already studied for export coupled with the percentage of which are on NEM. So we'll take a partnership to answer some of those questions, but great feedback.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
If we have one more, let's do one more, and then we'll move on to the proposal.
Simple. There are no other hands in queue.
All right. Okay, thanks. Good questions, folks. Getting everyone on the same page. So let's go to slide 20. All right. So based on the problem statement that we just discussed from the working group and discussion paper, the ISO is proposing to remove the requirement that we just discussed for scheduling coordinators to set customer load meter data during dispatch intervals to a minimum of 0 during periods when those customers may be exporting energy onto the distribution system physically. So a key to this proposal is to remove the rule restricting the metering of exports at the utility retail customer level for those customers that are already approved for export onto the distribution system. So this could include for CPUC jurisdictional utilities, a Rule 21 export interconnection or something similar. And then at the same time, the ISO would introduce a new floor that prohibits exports at the level of the entire demand response aggregation or resource. So this new limit would ensure that that DR, such as PDRs and RDRs, continue to represent demand curtailment, just now at the aggregate level, in a way that corresponds to market topology and ensures that unmodeled congestion is not created by DR dispatch. So ultimately, the current demand response business practice manual indicates that PDR and RDR are load curtailment products. Performance for the resource will be measured in aggregate based on individual location load curtailment only, and must not include measured export of energy from any of these individual locations. So that approach would change under this proposal. All right, so this is the core of the proposal, and I've got a couple examples that will follow that I've drawn from the paper and elaborated on. So let's go to the next slide. So under this example, if a customer is approved for distribution level exports, their load meter data would no longer need to be replaced with 0, or sort of the between the greater of 0 or the meter data measurement during the SQMD calculation process for DR resources. So this example again is from the paper. And so this is illustrative, showing the DREM calculation for a single end-use customer with a behind-the-meter storage, similar to the one we just looked at. So here you'll see the row that indicates zeroed out load during dispatch is gone, and the intervals highlighted in green represent periods where the actual load would no longer be replaced with 0 during the export intervals, as it would be today. So what this does is it results in higher DREM values for the end-use customer. So you can see here, the numbers are, I believe, the same as the example in the baseline value as well as in the actual load row, but we end up seeing a higher DREM for this customer because the exports are counted in the dispatch behavior. So there's an example. However, stepping back for a moment, the intent of the proposal is not necessarily to transform PDRs into a true generator, something more like the demand response distributed energy aggregation model that already exists, but we're looking to more accurately reflect or recognize the net load behavior of customers with behind-the-meter resources while still preserving that fundamental structure of PDR as load curtailment at the aggregate level. So let's go to the next slide, and then we can talk about these examples if there are questions. And then I'll just have one more slide with the discussion questions. So now I'm going to talk about that new rule at the aggregate level to ensure that PDRs are still representing curtailment at the resource level. So we're proposing this new floor that limits exports at the level of the DR aggregation. This ensures that DR resources continue to represent curtailment, like I just discussed. And it also ensures that those individual customer contributions are still captured before aggregating their energy measurement. So we have two examples here. The example on the left can be found in the straw proposal document. The key is to understand that under the new export rules, the actual load during dispatch row that you see here with the green highlights could still be subtracted from the baseline value row, as we discussed, to produce that uncapped DREM row, which is the sort of the middle row there. This means that, however, with the new rule, the capped load during dispatch row would replace the actual load during dispatch row in the total calculation, meaning that the final calculation for DREM for this resource would be 8 in the baseline value row minus 0, which would produce a DREM of 8. What it would not be is 8 minus negative 5.5, which would result in 13.5. That would be restricted under this new aggregate rule. So this example looks a little different than the ones you saw. Instead of seeing intervals in the hours, the columns represent different customers. So I just wanted to highlight that so we don't get confused. And then the example on the right represents a different set of customers. Instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, it's A, B, C, D. So these customers are used to illustrate the fact that a PDR that consists entirely of customers with behind-the-meter resources, essentially all of them capable of exporting at the site level, this proposal would actually not change the DREM for these customers, because although we would not limit exports at the site level, under the old rules, the actual load during dispatch row would be 0 anyway, which would result in a DREM of 8.0. But under the new rules, the negative 8 in the actual load column would be replaced by a 0 highlighted in yellow, which also results in an 8 kilowatt energy measurement. That was a little convoluted, but I'm hoping that looking at these two examples of two different sets of customers illustrates that essentially PDRs that have customers with some heterogeneity in their customers between those with BTM resources and those without, such as customers 3 and 4 versus customers 1 and 2, would see incremental increases in energy under the proposal, whereas the aggregation on the right, where each customer has the ability to export at the site level, would actually not see a difference. So I hope that side-by-side is helpful. Let's just drive the point home here with the next slide, and then we can take some questions if there are any on the examples, and then we'll go to discussion. So big picture, again, how this would be achieved is a change to the performance evaluation methodologies and demand response energy measurement calculations for the meter data. So this is essentially a metering process change, and it would change how that information is calculated. The ISO does not calculate that data today. We actually used to in the past, but it is now the responsibility of the scheduling coordinator to do this calculation. So the implementation burden would primarily lie with the SCs or the DR providers to do the calculations differently. So I just want to highlight that. It's actually, I'm not going to comment on implementation specifically, but we're seeing this as a relatively light lift on implementation on the ISO side. It depends on the details of the proposal, but the calculations being done by participants means that that is the primary change that we're looking at here. Okay, so let's pause, make sure we can answer a couple questions, and then I do want to take maybe 15 minutes to discuss a couple questions that I have for the group.
Okay. We have one hand from Brian Turner, Advanced Energy United.
Hi there, thanks. Another pretty basic question. I wanted to ask why our baseline value is customer or aggregation of customers specific. If what I believe the goal here, well, there's several goals here, but part of the basic framework is that we're not showing export beyond the sublap, which suggests to me that that baseline value of export for what counts as export could be the sublap level of demand. And so if we're right, so if the export from the aggregation is still not zeroing out or going beyond 0 for all load within the sublap, we can still establish that we're not that there's no export beyond the sublap to the transmission system. And so again, this is a pretty basic question, but why has that not been considered, or was that considered and eliminated?
Yes, great question, Brian. Just give me a moment here. So something I would highlight to your question, what I'm hearing your question is essentially why limit the exports at the total combined customers within the PDR instead of perhaps the total load of all customers that is served by the LSE at the sublap level. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. So essentially because, as I sort of alluded to, PDRs are thought of as load curtailment products within the customers that they are aggregating. And so I think that the consideration we've made at the ISO is if we did allow export beyond just the resource and its aggregated customers, that would essentially bring this product to be more of a generation product and be exporting onto the transmission system in aggregate. And so the challenge there is, one challenge I would highlight is PDRs today receive deliverability from the ISO and can appear on the net qualifying capacity list and can be accounted for as resource adequacy capacity. This assumption about deliverability for PDRs would be changed if we allowed export beyond the aggregated customers, because it would start to act more as a generating resource in sort of a true sense, more similar to a distributed energy resource aggregation model.
And I'll just add that would also necessitate going through the deliverability review process to ensure that when a PDR exports, if it were to be allowed to export up to the sublap, that it doesn't take away deliverability or kind of impact deliverability of other resources.
So I'm hearing two issues. One is definitional, and another is that impact on deliverability of other resources.
Well, Anya, do you want to cover or Ansel, do you guys want to cover the deliverability point more? Because Brian, I think one of our basic assumptions here in this initiative is that folks wanted to be able to move quickly. And this deliverability assumption, I think, has existed since the ISO was formed. And so, Anya, did you want to cover kind of what it would mean to re-examine that? Or Ansel?
I think we would, I'd say if folks want to have that deliverability conversation, let's have our deliverability team here. But at a high level, allowing that requires these resources to go through deliverability, which is in contrast to that desire that we have heard from stakeholders to be counted as deliverable as PDR is today.
Okay, that's enough. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Brian, we got two more hands in the queue. We're going to go to Alan next.
I think I got muted. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Alan Wong from SCE. We don't have our metering team here today on the call, but I do have some questions regarding this metering process change. I believe it was mentioned in the BPM where it currently states that the values need to be 0. Since you're replacing it, do you guys have an idea of sort of what this already approved language would look like moving forward? And the reason I asked is you indicated in this last point here, the burden does indeed lie with the scheduling coordinators and not the ISO, hence the light lift. However, scheduling coordinators are CAISO mandated to do the self-audit requirements on the SQMD. So I think we would probably need a bit more specific sort of what that already approved language would look like in the BPM moving forward.
Yeah. We would definitely welcome input in that, because we want to make sure that we get that right. It's PDRs and the sort of review process by the utility distribution companies and the load serving entities is important and is a, you know, provides several checks on the accounting of PDR customers and site level participants. So yeah. And I'm sorry, was there a specific question or was it just a comment? I missed the.
No, it's more of a question. I think it's a pretty significant question from an audit standpoint. Again, these are CAISO mandated audit requirements, self-audit requirements. So if this is sort of the direction the ISO wants to take for this particular topic, and the burden lies with the SCs to provide the calculation of SQMDs accurately, I think we need some more specifics around, okay, what would qualify? Sorry, I'm just going to the prior slides you had where it kind of bolded already approved, I guess, methodologies or sort of reasons for exporting for the SQMD calculation.
Right. Yeah, so I think fundamentally the way that the calculations are occurring today, the ISO is routinely auditing that data to verify the accuracy and consistency of the submission to that meter data. You know, this is settlement quality meter data, so we need to make sure, as we would with any generating resource, that this can be verified, and because it's settling wholesale energy transactions. Of course, the DMM, the Department of Market Monitoring, also reviews this meter data and our audit results. So there's kind of an existing process that ensures that these calculations done by the SCs for DR resources is reviewed. But we can, if there are specific questions about that and kind of how the performance evaluation methodologies get reviewed and approved by the ISO, we can speak to those too.
Yeah, and maybe my question's not coming through clear, but since the ISO does have these requirements that are imposed on the scheduling coordinators for SQMD, I think we just want to make sure we're following these requirements, right? So if there are circumstances where we can reflect a export value and there are circumstances where we should not, I think that's where we want to make sure that we're following the proper requirements that's set by the ISO.
And Ansel, we'd probably set those in something like our BPM, where we lay those out clearly and seek stakeholder input to make sure we got the right words on paper, right?
Definitely. Yes, that's right.
So with this removal of the existing BPM language, is it just simply removing that, or is also removing it and replacing it with additional language to let SCs know what the changes are going to be and what we're going to be obligated to, you know, provide? If not, if you need to go back, that's fine as well. I just want to make sure that that's the BPM reflected in the future is consistent with something that we can follow. So.
Yes. The specific BPM language, as you know, will be kind of developed and reviewed through the existing processes for that at the ISO after we complete the policy change, but the current language that I'm speaking to in that straw proposal slide, we'll have to review the full BPM to make sure that, you know, it's clear about what is actually changing, and we're not just removing sentences, but we're clarifying what the bounds of the new rules would be. So I see what you're asking, and we'll try to make it clear sort of the new rules and what's changing from the existing rules if we go forward with this. So.
Yep, that'd be great. And again, our metering folks are on the call, but on the prior slide, it does say, like, you know, only for those customers that are already approved for export, onto the distribution system, they're going to want to have questions like, okay, well, how do we ensure that we're in compliance with those new changes? So thanks for taking the comment and question.
Of course.
We have a hand from Ed.
Sending Vote Solar, and I have a question. So the about the verification of the by the UDCs for the exports. So I think the proposal really hinges on the recognition that the exports only are for customers that are approved by the UDC to export energy. My question is sort of an administrative one. How does the CAISO going to flag that and monitor it and put it into your registration system? And you know, how does that get updated?
So, Ed, let's put a pin in that. I've got an open question on that in the next slide. So you're thinking on the right lines. Maybe I think there's one more chat question that we could get to, and then we'll go to that next slide and discuss that very issue.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. And Ed, will you introduce yourself? It didn't unmute you earlier.
Sorry. My name's Ed Smeloff, S-M-E-L-O-F-F, and I've been representing Vote Solar in this proceeding.
Thanks, Ed. We're going to go to the question in the chat from Katie Gallinger. How does this proposal account for the distribution line losses associated with the exports?
Yeah, good question from Katie there. I think some of the assumptions here are in PDR meter data calculations. We're simply taking the meter data. There are processes in place for the UDCs to review, utility distribution companies to review those customers before they participate as a part of a PDR. So that level of granularity is not accounted for in the meter data calculations for PDR specifically at the ISO.
And maybe I'll add, in response to Katie's question on if the proposal itself accounts for the distribution line losses associated with exports, you know, an implicit part of this proposal is, you know, there's also that aspect for LRA potential accreditation for an RA value. And it's really kind of processes that are in place to kind of establish kind of the QC of that resource that often kind of considers transmission or distribution line losses. So for instance, the CPUC's load impact protocols do have guidance for distribution loss factors and transmission loss factors, and that might be the kind of venue to address that kind of in the upfront QC counting, because really this proposal is about metering information we receive. Any follow-up questions there, Katie?
All right. Thanks, Anya. Let's go to the next slide. So with the remaining time, we'll maybe take 10 minutes or so here to just review these open questions that the ISO is looking for input from stakeholders. We also have questions about these specified in the comment template, so we would welcome written comments on these as well. So I'll just run through these first. So the first point is that the ISO tariff does specifically require that replacing export intervals with zero. There is language in here, and this is to Alan's question. Some of the language is specific to the metering generator output, or MGO methodology. But the proposal we're talking about here is developed to apply to all PEMs and all those calculations, including day matching, including weather matching, et cetera. So what we're thinking is, you know, we saw that there's very little use of the MGO baseline when we discussed this last year. This could have minimal impact. So one question is, should this proposed change apply to all methodologies? Are there any concerns with that approach? Or should we limit ourselves to that MGO baseline, which is sort of the baseline that exists designed for customers with behind-the-meter resources, but recognizing the current state of PEM application at the ISO, we wanted to frame this up. The second question is that sort of a meter data calculation question. So the proposal we're talking about does not require that the scheduling coordinator specifies which individual customers should be zeroed out. If the total resource limit rule is applied, basically there's no ISO business function that requires indicating which customers' exports were and were not counted. So the question I have, kind of an open question, is, are there other considerations for how this process should be accounted for and how individual customers should be treated under this proposal? What we're seeing is the ISO receives the aggregate information as well as that underlying load meter data for SQMD. So for the metering process itself, aside from the auditing process, it's one value for the entire resource. So we're sort of thinking, do we need to think more about this and make sure that we specify how this should be implemented by the SCs? And then the last question is more to Ed's question. So the change, as we discussed, is only allowed for customers that are approved for export onto the distribution system. Today, utility distribution companies do have visibility into which service accounts or customers are participating in PDRs, and they can compare these service account numbers with their interconnection status. So the UDC review process is, I would say, primarily serves to ensure there is no dual participation by customers in different programs between the ISO demand response or perhaps a retail program. But there are other, UDCs can use this information in the location review process as they see fit and necessary. So the question is, what feedback do stakeholders have on this part of the proposal on implementation, and how this could look sort of a number of ways, between a flagging process for the UDCs to see which customers are approved for export and which are not. It could be sort of a verification form by the demand response provider, perhaps. That could be serve as an attestation. We're open to thoughts here from all sides of this issue. So, okay, we're coming up on 10:20, but maybe we'll take a couple initial thoughts here and then we can regroup.
There's a question in the chat from Ed Smeloff asking, does the ISO need to make the decision as to which customers within the resource gets adjusted? Can the SC make this decision?
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was getting at in that middle box, is that there isn't a business need for the ISO to either have knowledge of or decide which individual customers are subject to this. It's because it's sort of an aggregate export limit. As long as it's meeting that aggregate limit, then that fulfills the limit on exports. So if that makes sense, there's no, yeah, I think I said everything there. So good question though.
And we do have, we have 4 hands in the chat. Just let us know when it's time. The first hand is from John. Silas, can you unmute John Hart?
Can you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me all right? Perfect, thank you.
Yes,
I'm John Hart with the California Solar and Storage Association, or CALSA. And first want to say thank you, really appreciate the whole team at the CAISO, all the work you put into this, and for taking our recommendations seriously. Going through the 3 questions you have, on the first one, I agree that with what you're proposing, to apply the not zeroing out exports to all the PEMs, not just MGO. So have optionality there it's very likely there's going to be aggregations with multi-technologies in there, and so having it apply to all of the PEMs will be beneficial. To the second question, I agree that the CAISO shouldn't dictate or have a rule around who can export and who isn't within an aggregation. I think having the flexibility there is extremely helpful, especially as customer load changes and needs might change and so forth. So having that, and then also agree that the exporting should only be for those customers who have an export agreement with the UDC as part of their interconnection. And then to the last question, I would support some type of, you mentioned the demand response provider having an attestation or something to that effect of who can export and who can't. There's already with the through Rule 21 different interconnection options, and there are customers who interconnect under non-export, and they're able to use power control systems certified under UL 3141 that ensure that they're not going to export. And then other customers interconnect with the ability to export. And so I think the technical perspective and verifying that customers are not exporting, I think that's taken care of already through the interconnection process. And so not something that I think that CAISO would need to police in any serious way other than, again, some type of attestation that customers are going to abide by their interconnection agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for the feedback from CALSA. We appreciate your thoughts there and hearing that perspective, so thank you.
Our next hand is from Doug.
Question or concern on that last question about the UDC doing, I assume that sold in a connection agreement and there's not some additional approval, in which case there's sort of like who gets approved for export, who doesn't, purely a Rule 21 question or an analog there. We've got a big concern that if we're in a world where the UDCs are both controlling export and approving for export and also aggregations, there's a potential, like we have a market participant who also controls the ability of other market participants to participate, which that conflict of interest by having you know, the UDCs both in control of the distribution grid and then also potentially participating in DAR kind of raise rules. And so I guess it kind of echoing the point
hey,
that
Doug,
CAISO probably doesn't need to police this.
The audio is choppy.
Okay.
I don't know if you can hear us.
Oh,
I'm getting
not super well,
the
but yeah.
flavor of what you're saying, but not the, so yeah.
I'll put it in the chat. Oh.
Okay,
no,
sounds good. Thank you, Doug. Sounded like a comment.
The chat's disabled, but
if there's a
the
question,
chat should definitely be enabled. We can make sure that's there. Silas, if you could do a check for that. If you hit the little speech bubble on the bottom right, it'll open up that panel. So we can read that after. We're going to go to Colin, and then we'll come back to your chat question comment, Doug.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, let's go to Colin.
Colin Smith. This is Colin Smith from LEAP. I just want to start out by commending the CAISO team for putting this proposal together. I think this would be a hugely beneficial change, and I especially appreciate CAISO's recognition of how kind of simply this change can be implemented in an industry that often reaches for overly complicated solutions. This is sort of a breath of fresh air in a way. I can weigh in quickly on these questions, though happy to follow up with written comments. Definitely agree with John Hart that this proposal makes sense to apply this to all pens. There to enable optionality for resources that want to participate in different baselines. The MGO baseline doesn't work for everyone, particularly residential batteries that can't meet the strict metering requirements for sub-metering in CAISO. And it would definitely maximize impact if it's applied to all PEMs across the board. I also don't think that there's any additional considerations for CAISO around how individual customers within a PDR are treated here. I think that really is up to the demand response providers, and we're more than equipped to make those decisions. I expect, DRPs would, never be exporting past the sublab under this proposal because they wouldn't get compensated for it, and they would make sure that their nominations are structured so that they're not kind of wasting, customers' load reductions. But if they're more than able to allocate the any potential contingencies internally among their portfolios. And export interconnection, agree that this is something that UDCs have an opportunity to weigh in as well, and definitely should. I don't see any reason for CAISO to police this. I do think that it is covered largely under Rule 21 interconnection rules, and LEAP and other DRPs, I'm sure, are more than happy to provide any information that UDCs might need to facilitate this approval process. Ending my notes on a quick question. I saw that the timeline was anticipating that the track 1 and track 2 proposals would be going to the board for approval in August, recognizing that is, of course, a loose timeline that's not set in stone. Would that, imply that these changes would be in place for like next year, next summer? What sort of is the timeline post approval?
Colin, that latter question on, based on what you're seeing here, what is our timeline for implementation? I think the goal would be implementation next year, but that is always subject to kind of all the IT projects and market design changes at the CAISO, and really kind of part of an intake process, and but the goal is next year if feasible.
All right, it looks like Colin is on mute again. Do you have any response, Colin?
Thank you, Anya, for that additional information. No further comments on my side.
All right, thanks,
Colin. Thanks for the feedback there.
We have Doug's question in the chat. The approval of the UDC purely refers to the interconnection agreement, right? If UDCs play any additional approval role, we have a problem if UDCs are also aggregating, that a market participant has a veto over the participation by other market participants.
Thanks for that comment, Doug. Yeah, the specifics of the utility distribution company review process for location review for customers participating in a demand response resource is outlined in the tariff, but it's primarily to prevent dual participation in multiple programs at any given time. So we hear you, and making a note of those comments.
Thanks, Hansel. We have one hand left from Eric Lyon, Renew.
Hi, this is Eric Lyon from Renew Home. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Mostly wanted to respond to the individual end-use customer treatment question. I think, as I understand it, Renew Home supports this idea, and just to be clear, I think we might even go a little bit further to say that the individual zeroing out of exports is probably just not applicable, right? It's not something you would need to assign to a specific customer or allocate across customers. It would just, everything would be added up, and if the sum is negative, you would zero it out at that point. And so just wanting to make sure that that is what is being proposed here. I think that sort of makes the most sense to us. But we'll also throw my support behind applying this methodology to all PEMs, not just MGO, and also suggest that the interconnection to the distribution system requirements probably best, dealt with the UDCs, and we're happy to support that.
Thanks for the feedback there, Eric.
No problem.
Great. That is all we have. Oh, we have Colin Smith. One follow-up question. I might have missed this in Anya's answer, but would this change require tariff revision?
This one would, yes.
Okay.
And
thank you.
Ansel, that's
we are
within
now
our
at-
timeline scope that was laid out earlier, just to confirm.
Yes, good point there, Heather. Thank you.
Okay, I was just going to give a time check that we are at 10:30.
All right.
Wonderful. Well, that was a great overview of track one. Loved hearing kind of those questions to make sure that folks are understanding the proposal and can inform their comments. We're going to take a quick 10-minute break and be back at 10:40 for track two. Thank you.
All right, we are at 10:42 and we're ready to get back at it. Let's go to the next slide.
All right, well, wonderful. Well, welcome back. Hope everyone was able to recaffeinate, grab some water before we dig into track two. I do want to just kind of take a moment and kind of think about track two. It's in a very different stage. It's more of an issue paper. There's not necessarily a proposal, but we're taking more of a comprehensive approach to evaluating how demand response and large loads participate across ISO markets. However, this isn't just a conversation limited to WMEDIAN entities kind of outside the CAISO BAA, but there is also a very relevant crossover for some of the questions we're asking in the ISO BAA. So I really want to kind of plug that early on. You saw the scope early on in the presentation in terms of the topics. And I think another way for us to think about it is kind of through the lens of questions, where we're looking for feedback. And these relate to questions related to the locational representation of demand response. It relates to how we register these resources. It relates to the existing model that we have for reliability triggered participation, and really asks a question if we should have additional pathways that would be available to all BAAs, including the ISO BAA, for an additional reliability triggered market product. We're also shining a mirror up to kind of how we enable flexible load to participate in our market, and are asking the question from a large load perspective. With the emergence of large loads, large data centers, do we need refinements to the existing supply or demand side options? And we also kind of have threaded in kind of a smaller kind of question related to operationalizing the existing RDR, really asking if we need to revisit the discrete dispatch exception criteria to more easily reflect those resources in our market. So these questions are in the comment template, but also threaded throughout the track two content that we'll be covering. Next slide. So our first umbrella topic within track two relates to demand response and large load participation options for WM and EDN BAAs. I think as we heard feedback for the need for reliability DR product and kind of the lack of use of some of the supply side market models by WM and EDN entities, and hearing about some of those barriers, while all of our DR models, kind of our reliability demand response, proxy demand resource can be used by all BAAs, we also have a recognition that the participation constructs were really developed at a time when it was only California participating and therefore are designed around a California context and might not align with the BAA-centric structure that WM and EDM BAAs use. And as we reviewed kind of our tariff and BPM, there's kind of three areas that emerge that might limit some of that scalable participation by external entities. Our current registration process, our locational requirements, and kind of the design of our current reliability triggered product. I think our goal here is to assess, with reform, will this incent kind of that supply side participation, recognizing that absent changes, some of that regional demand flexibility might be underutilized with external BAAs relying on the load forecast adjustments or manual curtailments rather than market integrated solutions. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll spend a moment talking about our sublap kind of framework. And the sublap stands for subload aggregation point. Our current tariff does have a requirement that for PDR and RDR participation, they need to be located within a CAISO-defined sublap. And maybe to back up, the purpose for having these sublaps are really to reflect transmission constraints for congestion management. There are also kind of settlement impacts that this can have in terms of the resources are settled at those load aggregation points, meaning that's kind of the aggregated LNP that they are paid, whereas they kind of are charging or their retail is served based on kind of that DLAP. And it also enables locational modeling of the DR impacts, recognizing that, absent these sublaps, you could create congestion issues with the dispatch of large DR resources. When we think about kind of how WM and EDM BAs are structured, the kind of architecture has really been at the ELAP, which stands for EIM load aggregation point, but it's really a construct to reflect kind of the BAA load. We have also provided technical guidance in the past that they could reflect a custom load aggregation point. But I think the kind of key question and kind of observation is that it would require a tariff update to reflect kind of DR participation at a BAA level, or it does create kind of a need to work with the WM and EDM BAAs on kind of the creation of those sublaps. And let's move to the next slide. I did just want to kind of note, kind of when we talk about sublap and the customized load aggregation point, these can operate. They're not mutually exclusive within the same BAA. For example, CAISO has both. And the sublap locations, the California BAA has 24 that are predefined, and when a resource registers, they indicate what sublap they're in. And really, this model, some of those DR resources is distributed across the sublap. It is less sensitive internally to locational congestion, whereas the custom load aggregation point allows for kind of a more customized solution. It can be more sensitive to load congestion, but but these are kind of possibilities out there in terms of how they could be modeled, either from a predefined perspective based on transmission constraints as to not impact transmission, or from more of a customized perspective to kind of more granularly look at the possible load congestion and better reflecting kind of the possible grid impact with that CLAB. Let's move to the next slide. Our big goal here is to really work with external BAAs to determine their preferred balance between congestion management needs and kind of the need to create that sub-lap or CLAP and administrative simplicity. Kind of there is that question of, does having that congestion management representation that the sub-lap offers, is that a value add, or is your system configured in a way where kind of DR provides system-wide emergency relief and there is not a concern about congestion management? And so our key question here is if there is interest in using the ISO sub-lap framework for congestion management, or if we should think about alternative approaches, recognizing that we would need to update our tariff to reflect that optionality. And even though I have reflected these as distinct options, I also want to recognize that not every BAA will find the same solution. And so we're looking to add more flexibility to our tariffs to recognize there may be some BAAs that want that BAA level aggregation, whereas others might want to create a sub-lap framework or CLAP framework. So with that, I'm going to kind of pause for questions. I did see one in the chat from Ed. Is there a hosting capacity analysis by sub-lap that's available for aggregators? My understanding, I will say at least in the CAISO BAA, we kind of have that from a transmission perspective, but when it comes to hosting capacity, my understanding is that that is available through kind of some of the CPUC requirements to provide that, and I will defer to the other BAAs on their responses if they want to kind of talk about that. But at least from the CAISO perspective, the distribution level hosting capacity is not kind of information that we publish or post, but I do understand through certain CPUC requirements that distribution level hosting capacity is available.
Okay. Thanks, Danielle. We have a hand from Brian Turner, Advanced Energy United.
Hi, Brian Turner, Advanced Energy United. Thanks. I think this is a very interesting topic that, in addition to the EIM, EDAM participant BAAs exploring, those stakeholders within those BAAs, like Advanced Energy United and their member companies, need to understand better. Each jurisdiction, each utility will have its own process for exploring these issues and developing proposals, whether within the utility or under some kind of regulated process with their PUC. So very also important for those stakeholders and the regulators to understand the issues at play here. To that end, I'd like to ask just for your thoughts or any explication you can provide regarding two issues. One, how does this compare to the load modification framework that I understand is the other option for how the other major track of options for how EDAM participants, EIM participants would use demand response as a resource in their participation in the market? So that's one question. How does the issues here around load congestion, do they exist in the load modification framework or not? That's one question. The other is broadly, what's entailed in CAISO generating sublaps for those BAAs? Take NV Energy, for instance. I only very roughly understand their system, but the north is very different from the south. Would those probably be two sublaps, or do you get in deep into the modeling with, in that case, in that example, NV Energy, would you need to get deep into their modeling to understand where the different areas were that have different congestion frameworks to the broader system? I hope those two questions make sense.
Maybe a follow-up question. I wasn't fully following your first question on how this relates to the load modification framework. And maybe I'll just note that, these resources are curtailment resources. And having this locational specificity helps prevent the CAISO from overstating relief in constrained areas or mispricing congestion, which could otherwise lead to LMPs or inefficient dispatch. And I'm not sure if that addresses that question or if you were going in a different direction.
Okay, so as I understand it, entity, NV Energy, Portland General can come in and say, we have these DR resources, we dispatch them in order to manage our load shape to avoid peaks. And that goes into, say, the resource sufficiency evaluation to say that our expected peak will be lower because we're going to utilize our DR resources. Does that not then have a geographic component to it? So is that?
So Brian, I think you're getting into, maybe it could, but for that load adjustment process, here we're only discussing the supply side resources, but for that load adjustment, I think what you're asking, the BAAs make the adjustment to the load at the BAA level.
Yeah. So it doesn't have, it doesn't implicate the congestion issues geographically.
Well, let's just say we haven't really ever asked. I don't know if we've had deep dives on that question. Anya, have we?
Not that I'm aware of, but that could be kind of in that forecasting conversation. I think usually that kind of provides system-wide relief, but to the extent that there are large DR resources and it does create congestion, it kind of ushers in the question of, is this helpful for those BAAs to better kind of have it dispatched kind of by location, or it may not be an issue because they're managing the kind of dispatching congestion on their own kind of outside of the market. Maybe to get at your second question, what is entailed in kind of performing this, it is a look at the transmission topography and particularly in kind of creating custom load aggregation points. It does require kind of mapping kind of those generation and load locations in a way to avoid creating congestion or to kind of align with kind of the intended outcomes of that BAA.
Yep. So more specifically about what's entailed, are we talking a year-long process? Are we talking millions of dollars? Or are we talking a month of cooperation and, $10,000? Do you have any indicators of that kind of what's the cost and blood and treasure involved?
I think there's it depends answer, which is maybe not satisfying, but recognizing that, for a BAA where this is not an issue, we can quickly update our tariff to say, it's not just that PDR and RDR can participate at the CAISO-defined sublab level, but also at the BAA. So from a kind of implementation perspective, it's really kind of providing that clarity in our tariff. But I think your question is really related to, if we go down the sublab route and if there is a CLAP created within that area, how long does that process take and what is the cost? And it depends on kind of the BAA's kind of understanding of that transmission topology or kind of their ability and how quickly they can map, what we already have in the full network model and what's already provided in that full network model, but really kind of putting them in certain zones. and letting us know what those zones would be. So I see we also have Nadia's hand up from PAC, and recognizing we've had to explore this topic in a similar way for GHG. I'm curious if she wants to opine on this, or if there are additional questions there, Brian.
No, that's fine for now. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Let's go to Nadia's hand.
Hi, this is Nadia Kranz with Pacific Core. Yeah, no, this is a really great portion of the proposal that I think could be workable. I'm still kind of digesting kind of like the ins and outs of how this would look, but I did want to express that with the CAISO. I think in terms of the overarching question of transmission management, that would continue, to be a BA function that we would be looking at. And so if there is a framework and flexibility that that the CAISO can provide in terms of, registration to allow the BAs to continue to operate as they do today, in terms of their congestion management and getting their programs registered, I think that is, a really great step forward, and something that we will definitely opine on in comments as well. But I just wanted to express that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you.
Helpful
We have
to-
one more hand.
Okay, great. And I'd say that transmission management would still be kind of a BAA function, but it's really a question of how do we reflect those known transmission constraints on an ongoing basis, so that if there are supply side resources, that when they're dispatched, they don't add to the congestion or create congestion as a result of their dispatch. So I just wanted to also react to some of those comments and appreciate that support.
All right, thank you, Anya. Our next hand is from Eric Lyon.
Hi, this is Eric Lyon from Renew Home. Just to start off sort of with a question, and maybe you covered this and I didn't quite follow, but I'm not fully understanding the difference between sort of maintaining the sublap framework and using custom load aggregation points. It seems like those could functionally fill the same sort of need. Like, is the sublap just something that the CAISO would want to be more involved in defining sort of permanently, versus custom load aggregation points are sort of more flexibly defined by the balancing authority? Or like, what do you see as the main difference between those two?
Yeah, Eric, that's a great question. Again, it's really with that opening hypothesis or question of, does it help the BAA to have more granular mapping of where their demand response resources are dispatched to avoid congestion? And so the BAA framework kind of can persist. I think we should update our tariff if that's the approach that external BAAs want to take. But in terms of the value add of kind of the sublap, it does kind of have a pre-defined aspect that can make locational registration easier. I think there are cases where a custom load aggregation has been established to further kind of define how DR wants to be settled, or for congestion management purposes. So you can have both that act side by side, and it really is kind of, I think your framing was apt and correct in that pre-definition versus, are there instances where, and I think a scenario where you might want to see a custom load aggregation point in a WM EDAM BAA is particularly in those cases of embedded load, or if there's an embedded load serving entity. So even if you have a broad area even if you had a broad area where a DR resource could be dispatched, maybe within that area there are CCAs, or there is an embedded LSE from a WM or EDM footprint perspective, where you would want to see that kind of on a more granular level than system-wide or within that greater sublab. So just some observations there.
Thanks. That is really helpful. I mean, I'd say in that case, we're somewhat agnostic as long as it is very clear, when we, register a customer that where the customer can be registered, right? Like, is it to a sublab? Is it to a custom lab? Or is it to, maybe it's a small BAA territory, like I'm sort of thinking of like Portland's current service territory. Maybe that doesn't need additional, disaggregation, and that can just be at the BAA level. So, I think as long as there's like a clear sort of pathway of like where sort of, I'm using air quotes, like on the grid, the participant can be registered, we're happy with any of these.
Great. And I'll note that, so I really appreciate that feedback. I did also kind of want to zoom out a little bit outside of your question, and this is more for the WM and EDM entities, noting that the sublabs also kind of help with kind of a forecasting aspect, and to recognize we can't forecast at a more granular level than the BAA. And when we're forecasting load, kind of it can't be more granular than the BAA without kind of more definition around what those zones would be.
And you're back on unmute. Okay, thanks, Eric. We have we have a question from Ed Smeloff in the chat. Could a large data center be a CLAB?
I don't see why not.
And we have one more hand, Brian Turner.
Hi, thanks. Different question. Wondering the applicability of our previous discussion around recognizing export under the PDR model in California and whether that's applicable to other BAAs. I understand that deliverability reaches a certain resonance or importance here because of the RA framework, which doesn't exist in other BAAs. But is that still a concern for CAISO specifically, deliverability beyond, for which the sublab may be important? I hope that makes sense. I'm wondering if there's a crosswalk between the previous discussion and this discussion about whether outside California BAAs should be aggregated at the BAA level or sublab. Do you see any crosswalk there?
Yeah, I think, the proposal we talked about earlier would apply at whatever granularity we move towards here outside of the CAISO BA. I think the deliverability question, because the ISO isn't responsible for interconnection of resources beyond the BA, the deliverability question is less applicable to the ISO rules.
But I think that's where you would, I think to the extent that the WM and EDM BAAs are interested in that approach, I think that's where they might want to weigh in and indicate kind of a preference from their kind of approach to deliverability on how they might handle that. So I don't think it's a great crosswalk between the aspects, but I think that's really a kind of a transmission and deliverability planning question for those BAAs to consider.
Okay, thank you.
We have no other questions, thank you.
Okay, well, not seeing any other questions. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So the next kind of question that we have teed up, particularly for WDM and EDM BAAs outside of the ISO BAA footprint, relates to the current demand response registration framework. And I'll note, just by way of background, that today the ISO's demand response registration framework kind of facilitates customer level site registration. And then there is a kind of separate component where for different time periods, a resource can be registered. So there can be kind of a registration at a location for a summer period, and then it goes away, maybe a new DRP kind of is involved. So it is for kind of time-bound and resource-specific at a certain location. There are also functions within our demand response registration system for dual participation, but it's not the system alone that does this dual participation check. It does require kind of active review by utility distribution companies, load serving entities, and demand response providers to the extent that the ISO identifies a customer enrolled in more than one resource. There's also a validation and compliance review, and really the system was set up kind of in a California regulatory environment with third-party aggregators, and where there can be differences between the utility distribution company and load serving entity. And I'll note that our tariff today requires the use of a demand response registration system, but it doesn't specifically say that it must be the ISO's demand response registration system. And I'll note that this can create challenges for BAAs outside of California, to the extent to which you can imagine a scenario where a BAA is both the UDC and LSC and doesn't have third-party aggregators participating. And so that need for kind of a UDC review and LSC review, they're really reviewing their own DR program setup, and they may already have systems in place for that registration where the DRRS becomes duplicative without kind of an added value. But I do highlight these functions because these are important and do provide value in terms of ensuring there isn't dual participation and help with that validation and compliance review. So with that in mind, let's go to the next slide. I think this causes us to ask the question for the WM and EDM entities outside of the CAISO BAA, if they would kind of like to continue with the practice of using the ISO's demand response registration system, or if they would like to have the option to manage their customer level registration through their own systems while providing standardized information to the ISO. So it really boils down to the option of continue to use DRRS or to allow a BAA managed registration system. I think when we think about kind of the trade-offs here, this issue really does recognize there is an administrative burden, but that a trade-off is how do we ensure that double counting does not occur? And meanwhile, how do we also ensure that there is adequate visibility for forecasting and operations, as well as kind of that audit trail in place for market monitoring and verification? And so this is an area where, still an open question, but curious if there's any initial feedback on this question or initial perspective, recognizing this might be an area that's both kind of a tool, but maybe duplicative with existing tools. And I'll note that to the extent BAAs are interested in using their own version of DRRS, and we hear that as a preference, we'll then we as a CAISO would then establish a set of information and reporting expectations to make sure there's sufficient visibility for market operations, reliability, settlement, and monitoring. I just wanted to note that, and I'll take a moment. I did receive a question in chat on how DRRS relates to DREM. Great crossover question. The creation of the resource ID, and I'll see if any of our DRRS experts want to weigh in here, but that creation of the resource ID that is kind of accomplished in DRRS is also kind of used for submitting settlement information to the CAISO in terms of the DREM that's submitted. There is also an aspect of DRRS that collects the PEMS, kind of notes the PEMS information in terms of the baseline used and kind of the metering plan in place.
Yeah, I'll just chime in and say, like, big picture, as Anya mentioned, essentially DRRS houses or captures certain information about DR metering, but really it's sort of, none of those things are exclusive to DRRS. Without the registration system, we could receive that information perhaps in other ways and receive, perhaps through the SQMD plan or similar channels. So they're connected right now for some of these functions, but it's not severable. It is severable, perhaps. If we went with option 2, we could find ways to make sure we get the meter data we need.
Okay, and we have a couple of hands up. First hand is from Nadia Kranz.
Hi, this is Nadia Kranz with PAC. Can you expand a little on, and apologies, I had to step away for a moment, on the option 2? Like, how does the CAISO envision kind of how we're managing our registration systems? Is this essentially us packaging the processes and procedures that we do today for our onboarding of our demand response programs, and essentially just, kind of passing that over to CAISO through like some standardized template of some sort that the CAISO provides to us? Or could you provide a little bit more insight there?
I think it would be both the policies and procedures in creating the kind of audit trail of kind of what baselines are being used, kind of the creation of, we need to have that process in place for creating a resource ID for submitting kind of settlement quality meter data in compliance with that PEMS and knowing what that is. And then there would also need to be a pathway for that information to be provided to the CAISO's Department of Market Monitoring or potentially to FERC. So it might not just be kind of the policies and procedures in terms of how that DRRS is structured, but also the underlying data of what those customers are and kind of the baselines that they're using for those monitoring and compliance purposes.
Okay. So essentially part of that would be, how does the BAA, I guess, evaluate that their program participants are acting in accordance with the program requirements, and then ensuring that that information is communicated to the appropriate channel, so CAISO, DMM, FERC.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much.
Nadia, our next hand is from John.
Hello, this is John from SCE. I'm kind of having a hard time understanding, the different options. I kind of want to know, basically, what are like the pros and cons of option 1 and option 2, in terms of like option one right now, we're currently using it. So does option one provide more benefits than the other, like as in accountability on knowing which resources are actually going to, or which customers are actually going to be there during times of when DRs are needed? And second, how does the accounting framework work with compensation and dual participation? So if you could provide some more clarity on that, I think it would be easier for us to choose one over the other.
And maybe taking a step back, I recognize this aspect is very relevant for WM and EDIM entities, and for CPUC jurisdictional entities. I recognize that Rule 24 and 32 requires utilities and DRPs to register customers in the CAISO's relevant systems for direct participation in demand response. And so we're not looking to do away with DRRS, but we recognize for other BAAs, they may have their own systems, or for non-CPUC jurisdictions, they may have their own systems. And so there's a lot of pros and cons and trade-offs that we articulate in the paper in terms of kind of the benefits of DRRS are really related to kind of creating that resource ID. There is a link kind of to the master file. There is kind of the creation of that resource ID for passing on settlement statements that kind of indicates what PEMs are used and the baselines used by those participants. It kind of creates that audit trail. To the extent that that is duplicative with outside BAA structures, the question on 2 is really, is that of interest? And if so, the CAISO can detail kind of what requirements would come with using an outside DRRS.
And
Got
Anya, I think what you're saying is that the DRRS is used by a number of California entities today, and the question you're teeing up in the paper is, how is that same DRS suitable for others? I don't think it's about migrating the existing folks into any new platforms, right? Or we can verify.
Sorry, you cut out for a moment for me, Heather. Was there a question for me there?
Never mind, my audio may not be good, so I'll follow up on the chat.
Maybe, is there a follow-up question, John, or any reactions?
No, I think Heather was asking whether or not is the proposal to and correct me if I'm wrong, Heather, to get rid of DRS and then migrate to a completely different DRS system, or is it? I mean, I think that's a clarification that she was mentioning.
No, and maybe to clarify, we are not proposing to do away with DRRS at all. The question is really, would we accept outside BAA's use of their own DRRS to the extent that it is duplicative to use the CAISO's DRRS?
Gotcha.
Is there
Okay.
interest in BAAs to kind of use their own version rather than the CAISO's?
Got it. So, question for CAISO BA entities, option 2 would not be an option, right?
This is really focused on kind of non-CPUC jurisdictionals. We're not looking at moving away from DRRS, and we recognize that the CPUC points to the CAISO's DRRS for use within the CAISO BAA.
Okay, gotcha. All right, thank you. Thanks for the clarification.
Thanks for the question.
There's one comment in the chat. Nadia Franz said PAC could support option 2 as it allows existing internal processes to be used and limit administrative burden on the DRRS.
Great. It's helpful to get that directional feedback, so really appreciate that, Nadia.
Okay, we have no other questions in queue. Oh, we just got a hand from Jared Satrom. Okay, that hand got lowered. Okay, we can come back, Jared, if you still have a hand. Oh, Jared, if you still have a hand, oh, there we go. Yeah, so we'll unmute you on our side, and then if you can unmute on your side.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Apologies about that. This is Jared Zatram from Voltus. I just wanted to express our appreciation for the CAISO thinking through this. I wanted to mention we have approached multiple large resources similar to data centers across the EIM footprint, and have just run into some administrative hurdles regarding things such as resource registration and vetting of this type. So just echoing others' comments here, appreciate the forward thinking, and I think this would be a big step in the right direction to enabling third parties to efficiently participate as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Jared. That feedback is very helpful.
All right. Okay. No other hands.
All right. Let's go ahead and move to our next slide. So CAISO has a reliability-triggered product that's available to all BAAs called Reliability Demand Response Resource. And as we consider kind of participation in outside BAAs and as we reflect on the number of non-market reliability products we're seeing, it raises the question for the CAISO, not just for kind of non-CAISO BAAs, but also even within the CAISO BAA, of if there's a need for a new reliability-triggered product, or, and this is more for the WM and EDM kind of outside CAISO BAA question, are there modifications that are needed to the existing RDRR construct to adequately support their needs? And really raising this, I think, in the working group, there may have been kind of some questions if RDRR was really applicable to outside BAAs, and I want to emphasize it is, but also acknowledge that, we don't have any non-CAISO BAAs actively using RDRR today. We understand, there's kind of some metering requirements, there are kind of a bidding requirement, there is kind of aspects of the RDRR that may not be conducive to how some of the external BAs represent their reliability demand response. And so I think that this is kind of where we'd like to understand if there are specific changes that are needed, and we're happy to have kind of a breakout session just on RDRR specifically to kind of walk through that again. But also recognize, on our side, when we look at, well, what would it take if a non-CAISO BAA wanted to use RDRR? We too recognize that there's some operational enablement that we would need to do, particularly around enhancing our tools and processes so that they could independently activate and manage RDRR. I think the other kind of option is kind of understanding what the gaps are with RDRR, but also considering what that new reliability-triggered product looks like. And for the CAISO BAA, I do want to emphasize that, again, since all of our market models are intended for use for all market participants, this would be an additional market, kind of reliability-triggered market product within the CAISO BAA. So kind of a big question of, is there kind of a need to modify RDRR, or do we need to go as far as developing a new product? So would that be a reliability triggered GR market product that has greater flexibility? What does that flexibility look like? Would it also kind of have a similar approach to RDRR where, you know, the bids are submitted and kind of lowest cost resources are treated, where, you know, RDRR does have that economic option, but then it also has the kind of feature of where it's only during reliability conditions where those bids are released for dispatch. And so do we want to take a similar approach, or is there kind of a new way that these reliability megawatts should be triggered for other VAAs, or even within the CAISO VAA? I think we've heard from a number of stakeholders that there's a desire for kind of these resources to count in the resource sufficiency evaluation, and recognizing that, you know, we count those megawatts and there's kind of certainty that they will be dispatched. And from a settlement perspective, you know, thinking about, you know, yes, pay when dispatched, but other than UIE, are there charges that should apply for non-performance? Recognizing non-performance charges today are really handled in the retail agreements that underpin RDRR. For example, there's one LSE that has a $6 per kWh charge for non-performance for not reaching a firm service level during those dispatch events. So kind of thinking through, is there value in kind of modifying what we already have, or will that not go far enough? And do we really kind of need to think through what a new reliability triggered product will look like? So big questions there. I'm not seeing any hands. So I may go to our next slide, given kind of our time. So bear with me. I realize this is kind of a large, kind of a decision tree can be hard to digest on the spot. And so I'm going to provide some framing, but think of this more as a reference kind of placemat. And I've also included in the appendix and in the paper kind of decision tree that we have for demand response and distributed energy resources. But recognizing that large load can represent a significant kind of dispatchable capacity to the system, our kind of key question in this issue paper is, do we have the right market models or demand side options in place to reflect that large load? And I do want to caveat that the ISO isn't presuming that all large loads are flexible or should automatically be treated as supply side resources. But our intent here is to create a set of participation options that really accommodates a range of capabilities and business models, so that large load can choose to represent its flexibility or just its consumption in the market in an appropriate way. So again, our approach here is really emphasizing optionality. Those loads that are really capable of measurable, dispatchable, and reliable response, we want them to have access to kind of that supply pathway that we already have in place for kind of how we think about traditional demand flexibility. But we also want those pathways in place for those loads that are unable or that don't desire to actively participate, to kind of have either forecast-based treatment or to be covered with demand-side bidding, but really kind of to have these pathways up front. We want to reduce barriers to participation and provide transparency into those options available. And the decision tree does bifurcate into supply and demand side, and it starts with a revenue-seeking question. But I'll say that this is really a shorthand for whether the resource intends to actively participate in wholesale markets through but it really represents kind of a broader set of considerations. So the dispatchability of that resource, their scheduling capabilities, if they have metering and telemetry and what those requirements are, as well as their settlement participation. So again, I want this to kind of convey the fact that we want to make sure that we have the right market models in place, but we are not predetermining how that large load should participate. But to the extent that large load does participate, and this is really where, you know, for the LSEs or BAAs or UDCs where you've been having conversations with large load, you know, we'd love to hear your feedback on, or if we have large load customers on this call, we'd like to understand the extent to which kind of this reflects. And really, you know, once we break it down, whether it's supply or demand side, you know, on the supply side, it's that market model construct, and then determining, can that large load, does it want to participate routinely? And maybe it's just the generation that's kind of coupled with that large load. Do they want to participate routinely and economically using kind of our PDR pump load or DARE constructs, or is it really kind of just for kind of break the glass situation where you want a reliability triggered product? If not, if that kind of market model and kind of response to market awards is not the right pathway, there's really kind of the demand side options. And there we kind of peel things back in terms of, you know, if that large load can bid separately, you know, it could be carved out and use day ahead demand side bidding. And if not, we have kind of more of the demand forecast, whether that's non-conforming or conforming load. And each of these, you know, the blue box here that you see envelop some of the screen really indicates when metering is required, and in some cases telemetry. So take this kind of back to your teams internally. We'd love to hear kind of if there is an area where you're seeing large loads come online, where there's aspects to our current participation pathways that might prove challenging, and we'd like to hear about that and refine our market models to the extent that it helps facilitate that large load, best reflecting its capabilities. Any comments or questions?
I'll just chime in and reiterate that the last three issue areas of sub-lab construct, the registration system, and RDRR in the regional markets, I think we're primarily aimed at non-CAISO BA entities participating in our real-time and day-ahead markets. This section of the paper and the slides is trying to establish helpful information for both CAISO BA load serving entities and balancing areas outside of the California footprint in our regional markets. So there's less of a distinction there. I think I'll also highlight that in the paper we talk about the related effort in the ISO BA, which is our large loads considerations initiative, and that is primarily focused on interconnection and transmission planning and service offerings in the ISO BA. But in that paper, we kind of defer to the DDEMI efforts around market participation. So this is those efforts for both the ISO BA LSCs as well as regional entities.
Great. I see we also received a comment in the chat in terms of kind of a need to take this back and kind of questions about how best to provide feedback. We are requesting comments back in written form in about 2 weeks' time, but we're always happy to meet with you if that would be helpful. Not seeing any other hands, I'm going to move on to our next slide.
Well, Anya, before you move on, I don't want folks to lose this excellent diagram. And I think we worked really hard to put this together so it would be helpful to people. We hope this answers a lot of questions. If there are questions unanswered by this diagram that you'd like to see us add, I think that's something else we'd like to hear.
We have one question from Ed Smeloff. if there is a customer that has data centers in different BAAs, could they participate in something like PDR?
Again, this kind of question, and Ed, I appreciate that question. Maybe we'll kind of pose a question back of, if there's a customer that has data centers in different BAAs, is the question about if they can participate in one PDR? No, they would need to kind of register that PDR in a BAA. Your question also gets to the question of like how to define large load. And there are, to the extent that it is kind of just large load that's aggregated, if it's relatively small and aggregated, we may need to think about kind of how to think about that sizing. But theoretically, large load or load in general could show up as a curtailment service, like using the PDR market model to the extent that that BAA kind of allows that usage. I'll note, there's kind of that aspect of wholesale market participation, but there also needs to be that retail underlying agreement with kind of the customer and their utility as well to facilitate that participation.
Thanks, Anya. I don't see any other questions or comments.
Okay, let's move on to our next slide. And this is our final topic. It is related to our reliability demand response resource and that product. We've talked about, if modifications or changes are needed. I think kind of at least in the modifications area, we did receive kind of some feedback around the exception criteria that we have for a certain type of RDRR that's considered discrete. That means kind of if it can only operate on or off, and kind of re-examining the exception criteria in cases of kind of aggregation of those resources. So I think this area of the issue paper examines kind of reassessing that exceptions criteria. It maintains that CAISO final review to understand, to what extent should we allow kind of those aggregations when it comes to discrete RDRR and kind of removing that cap. So with that, let's go to the next slide, which is really about our next steps. Really looking for your feedback and comments in written form by March 27th. If you do have questions, feel free to reach out to Stakeholder Affairs. We're also happy to meet with you and discuss some of these elements if it would be kind of helpful in your review. And as I noted kind of at the top of the hour, I recognize, not every topic was explored in our track 1 or track 2 timeline, and we have a section at the end of the document related to scope that kind of helps identify how some of those 31 topics might be kind of contemplated in the kind of near, mid, or longer term. But I did want to kind of go back to my opening statement, say if there are additional kind of areas of feedback, would love to kind of hear them. We've got another 16 minutes of discussion, and this might be a good time to take those questions to the extent folks wanted to talk about scope.
We have a hand from Josh Arnold.
Yes, good morning. Josh Arnold, GDS Associates. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful.
Good morning.
So I'd actually like to talk about the prioritization and the processes here. You showed on slide 6, way back when, that there were 3 primary items that came up during the DDEMI working group process. The first, obviously, was the changes to allow for exports, which you outlined under track 1. The second was the expansion of the PEMS. And the third then was the biddable load and the expansion for large load. But under that third item, the comments specify that we really shouldn't start that process if it gets in the way of items 1 and 2. And I'm really wondering why the decision was made to prioritize the large load process in Q2 over the new PEMs.
And Josh, I appreciate that feedback kind of going into that decision-making framework. Some of it has been related to just internal bandwidth and kind of a recognition that we do have some kind of active discussions with large load coming online and related initiatives that discuss it. There's also a recognition that while some PEMS kind of aspects are touched on in track 1, we have a kind of internal parallel effort to further kind of recognizing there's going to be a much longer time window and resourcing to kind of look more holistically at our PEMS and kind of tee up some of those questions and have those resources in place to fully evaluate it. It was both kind of a resourcing and scoping exercise that we had to kind of make some tough calls on.
Okay,
Yeah, I think a little more.
Go ahead, Ansel.
Yeah, just specifically on the track 1 portion, which is, designed to meet some of the stakeholder requests in that first point on slide 6. There's also some of the same internal teams that are working on that effort would also be needed to work on the bigger PEM reform. So I think that's part of also why we're taking that staged approach.
Okay, I understand very well why we would be starting with the export of demand to get the negative meter values, effectively the generation injection values, because that's a meter change. It's a regulatory change in terms of any FERC filings that would need to be done. It's a policy change at the BPM side for updating those requirements and those specifications. And then it's mainly an SC change on the metering process. So that's an obviously priority issue because it's a low lift from a resource perspective. That's fully understandable. I'm just concerned that one of the main discussions we had during the working group was these new PEMs, and it does, or the refinements of existing PEMs, and it does seem more, I guess, more logical, more effective to transfer into that as a Q2 priority after the PEM work is done on the first item, on the track 1 item. I'm very concerned, given the amount of time that we took in the working group and the amount of benefit that we seem to recognize in the working group of these new PEMs, that's getting lost for things that may or may not, under the large load process, may or may not actually be materializing as may be expected. And I'm also looking back to the work we've done in the past on, say, electric vehicle PEMs that really didn't go very far, if anywhere, in actual market process. So I understand the resource constraints. There's a lot going on, both for the CAISO and for the participants. I'm just really confused and concerned by that prioritization. I'll definitely be putting these in comments.
Thank you, Josh.
We have a couple questions in the chat. One is from Kyle Grosses Henderson. Will a Q3 working group be delayed if tracks 1 and 2 require more time?
I think that's kind of subject to resourcing constraints and how policy evolves. So we hope that is not the case. We're kind of currently staffed and planning to embark on that working group in Q3, but we also recognize there, to the extent that policy changes dramatically or resourcing changes dramatically, it is subject to change.
Okay, thank you. The other question is from Ed Smeloff. If a DRP finds that its aggregation is consistently hitting the new resource floor, what would be the CAISO recommend as a long-term pathway for the resource? should they transition entirely into the DARA framework?
That could be one path. I think another path is registering customers that do not have export capabilities and have higher loads, so that those customers can be accounted for within the larger resource aggregation and give more, then there would be more impact from the customers who are exporting.
And we have a hand from Josh Hart. And both Kyle and Ed say thank you. Okay, let's unmute John Hart. Go ahead, John.
All right, thank you very much. John Hart with CALSA. A question related to last year, phase one of this, one of the major problem statements, and I think it was mentioned in one of the first slides, was related to revenue grade metering and relaxing the requirement, allowing for more device level telemetry that's not revenue grade. Is there any discussion of that in the paper, and any thoughts on if or when that issue will be taken up?
So maybe a couple of points there. While we're not contemplating moving to device level participation, those metering requirements would be part of those midterm PEMS reforms discussions, just recognizing kind of resourcing in order to kind of take on those reforms more comprehensively. A great question.
Okay, would that be as part of track 2, or is that after track 2?
It's more of the midterm, so 2020, so essentially taking that up next year.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that is all the questions in hand we have at this time. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, and this is just our usual Energy Matters blog promo for insights for the ISO grid and market operations. You can subscribe to this blog, and there's a link there at the bottom. And I think this is, Anya or Ansel, do you have anything else before we wrap up?
A big thank you to stakeholders. You know, there's been a big gap between our kind of a few months since we kind of were last discussing the working group and the final discussion paper, and we're here in policy development and really appreciate your time with us this morning and feedback and participation. So really looking forward to working with you all over the next year on our 2026 scope. So thank you. Anything to add?
No, that's great. Thanks, Anya. Thanks, everyone, for your feedback.
And have a great Friday. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anya. Thank you, Ansel, for today's presentation. And thank you, Silas, our event producer, for your support. The recording of this will be posted in a few business days to the initiative page. And Silas, you may now conclude the call.
All right, thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you all in the audience for joining us today. With that, our call is concluded, and you may now disconnect.